Good morning. Thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. This last week, we had the opportunity to celebrate my wife Trista's birthday. Birthdays, Christmases, other special occasions are often times when we like to give gifts in a way to show people how much we care about them and love them. Receiving gifts are often times of anticipation, excitement, and joy. We often drop hints or make lists just knowing that we'll get something that we like. But truthfully, our best laid plans don't always work out. The gift that you're hoping to get for somebody is out of stock, or maybe you plan a picnic and it rains, or the event gets canceled. In life, we learn pretty quickly how to deal with disappointment. Each one of us know what it's like to expect one thing and to get something else. To have hope in one area, only to discover what it's like to be disillusioned. Maybe you told your husband, "These are the boots that I want. These are the size of the boots that I wear. This is the color of the boots that I would like for you to buy me as a gift." And then he decides to be creative and goes off grid. And when you get the box, it looks like the right shape and the right size, but when you open it, they're not boots. It's a Roomba. The worst possible thing he could have bought you. Or maybe you hinted over and over about how you would really like the new iPhone, and your wife hands you a box, and the box is a little big to be an iPhone. I know, maybe she got you the iPhone Plus, and your excitement is replaced with disappointment when you tear off the paper, discover that you got nose hair clippers. You see, apparently, that's the way sometimes life works. There are times when you simply don't get what you want, you hoped for, you wished for, or even prayed for. I think it's a part of adulthood for us to learn how to swallow our disappointment. We learned how to just kind of pretend that everything's okay, yet inside we're thinking, what in the world is this? I would imagine that you could probably tell your own stories of when you opened up a present and you thought you were getting one thing, only to discover something that wasn't exactly remotely closely to what you wanted. This morning, our view of his story takes us to the book of Ruth. And I imagine if it was a movie, you would witness this roller coaster of emotions. There would be an expression of joy and disappointment, anger, peace. Their story is this perfect reflection of life if we live long enough. The story opens up, we meet a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and we don't know much about them. We are told that Naomi's name means pleasant, which seems to capture her life early on. But there's going to come a day when life throws them a curveball. A severe famine hits the land, and it gets to the point where it's so bad there's no way they can survive and stay where they are, which is huge because they're living in the promised land. This is not just a place they call home. This was tied to their identity. Each family has a place of land designated to them that is passed on from generation to generation. And you just don't leave your inheritance. You just don't give up on that piece of land that was given to you by God. This is your part of the promise. So the very fact that they left their inheritance shows how desperate they are, how dire their circumstances were. I try to think about it this way, that this is what they were experiencing. Let's say a man comes home from work and you can tell it's not been a good day. He sits down with his family over dinner and he says, "They let me go at work today." His wife is very reassuring. She says all of the right things. "Don't worry, you'll find another job. You have plenty to offer. You're smart. You're creative. Things are going to turn around." But they don't. 6 months later, they've depleted most of their savings. 2 years later, they've sold their cars. They've moved out of their house into an apartment. And there's no getting around the fact that this isn't just affecting their family. This is affecting everybody in this region. Everybody seems to be impacted by this in one way or another. Every day, this man and his wife's biggest concern is, what are we going to eat for our next meal? At this point, you begin to wonder, how did we ever fret about the things that used to consume our thoughts? I mean, how do you stress over what color you're going to paint a bathroom or what you're going to wear? Because right now, the only thing you can think about is, how am I going to feed my kids? As those parents get on their knees at night beside the bed, it's really hard to focus on those nightly prayers because of the growling of their children's stomach. Life passed desperate months ago. Finally, the husband looks at his wife and says, "We can't stay here. We're going to have to move. We got to try something different, or there's no way we can survive this." That's what's going on. That's why Amalek packs up his family and they move out to this country of Moab, which Moab sounds nice, right? But it's not suburbia. The folks living in Moab are descendants of the city of Sodom. It's a pagan town that has a lot of prejudice towards the Israelite because they're the sworn enemies of God. I mean, God did wipe Sodom off the map. God did kill their grandparents. But the need for food is greater than their fear, so they move into the land of their enemies. I wonder if Naomi is beginning to think that they've hit rock bottom. They've lost their home, their land. But she still has her husband, and he's a good man. She still has her boys. They're healthy. They're strong. And she still has God. When they move to Moab, her faith is intact. It's going to be okay. But once they get there, things go from bad to worse. Amalek dies, leaving her to raise two boys in a foreign land all by herself. Her sons grow up and they fall in love with Moabite women. And instead of giving her grandchildren, we find out that her boys also die and leave this widow to provide for two other widows. I think there's some of us this morning that get it. We know loss and disappointment. And there are some today that are going to have to get ready for this because you might not have experienced this in your life yet, but you will. None of us are exempt from this. If it's not here right now, it's coming in your life because we live in a broken world. We're going to experience pain and heartache. The only thing that Naomi has left is a pile of broken pieces scattered on the floor. And after losing everything, there's nothing left to do but to go home and just hope that what she heard is true. Things are going to be better in her small town. And that's just the first 6 verses of the book. As I'm reading through the story of Ruth and Naomi this week, I keep asking myself this question: what is it about? It's easy to say this is a story of loss, or it's a story of a woman who loses her home, her land, her husband, her sons. And it is a story about loss. But the story doesn't have to be about loss. Yes, Naomi loses a lot, but it's not a story about loss. Back in the 1990s, Jerry Sitter was involved in an accident when a drunk driver hit a van that he was driving. He escapes the accident with no physical harm, but the accident took the lives of his mom, his wife, and his daughter. In a singular moment, 3 generations of women that he loved and adored, were all gone because of someone else's carelessness. He wrote this book about his journey from despair to hope entitled A Grace Disguised. And in that book, he writes, "The experience of loss does not need to be the defining moment of our story. The defining moment can be our response to the loss. The story doesn't have to be about the loss. The story could be about our response to the loss." I fully understand that it's one thing for me to say that, yet it's something completely different when he says that. I used to tell my boys all the time, you don't get to decide how much time you get to play. You only get to decide how hard you're going to play in the time that you're given. That might not sound very spiritual, but I think there's a mustard seed in that. And there's one in the story, or a couple in the story of Ruth and Naomi for us this morning. We all get to the point in our lives where we have to decide if this is the moment that defines me, or is my story going to be about something different? I think there are a few lessons or applications that we can pull out of this story this morning, this upper story. There's some mustard seeds that we need to gather up when we look at what God is accomplishing through this story so that we can see God's redeeming story in our lives as well. And I think the first mustard seed we need to pick up is that we have to trust God's plan. There's this overriding theme throughout the book of Ruth of God's power, God's control, God's influence, God's seen everywhere in the story, weaving his purposes through events and circumstances. I mean, think about it. He uses a famine to take a Jewish man and his family to Moab. One of his sons marries this Moab woman. Then both of these widow women travel back to the promised land because they've heard a rumor that the famine has ended. Naomi teaches Ruth about God and about the ways and the things of God, and Ruth makes a life-changing commitment. You know, I really love coincidences, even though I don't believe in them. I mean, think about the coincidence in Ruth 2:3. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father in law, Elimelech. It was a coincidence, right? I mean, there's no way that the same God that created the heavens and the earth could have placed Ruth in that particular field on that particular day. Or did he? Ruth has gone through some terrible things, but every difficulty, every question, every uncertainty, every broken heart is God's way of doing something better that would have never happened in her life otherwise. God's grace begins when we come to the end of ourselves. And you might be completely unaware of what God's doing right now or how he's guiding your decisions and your actions. But just because you don't see him doesn't mean that he's not working everything together for his ultimate glory. There's an ancient prayer that says, I trust him so much that I do not doubt he will provide whatever I need for body and soul, and he will turn to my good whatever adversity he sends me in this sad world. He's able to do this because he is Almighty God. He desires to do this because he is a faithful Father. The story of Ruth reminds us to trust God's plan. The upper story reminds us that God is always at work, sometimes out in front, sometimes behind the scenes. We're being called to trust his purposes for our lives, especially when things look bleak. You see, we're often stuck at life looking at this 6-foot lower view, and God is getting to see and to write from this beautiful upper view and upper story of our lives. The upper story of Ruth reminds us that God loves to redeem. The story of Ruth is not a story of loss, and I know there's a lot of loss in the story. The story of Ruth has endeared itself to so many of us because it's a story of redemption. I mean, Naomi changes her name because she thinks she's coming back empty, that God has abandoned her. But if she could just wipe away her tears long enough, she would be able to see that God is really at work in her life. In the midst of what seems to be an incredible loss, we see that God is redeeming her story the entire time. The story of Ruth is a story of God actively working and redeeming. First, he redeems Naomi's loss with this unlikely friendship. You know, God has a way of doing that. We experience loss and grief, and God will bring someone that will come alongside of us and give us the strength to get through. That support system is not always who you think it might be. That's the case here. I mean, who would have guessed that a daughter-in-law from Moab would be the one that Naomi could have this close, connected relationship with, someone that they would love one another. In fact, in the text, when the village gets to know Ruth, even though she's from Moab, the people in the village say to Naomi, her daughter Ruth is better for her than 7 sons. In the midst of her grief, she discovers this friendship that helps her redeem the story. I think sometimes we need somebody to come alongside of us and to let us know that it's going to be okay. But that's not what usually happens. Usually in our distress, we try to push folks away. Naomi tries to do that in chapter 1. She tries to send Orpah and Ruth back to their parents' home so that they can find other husbands. She thinks she needs to walk this path of grief alone. But what she really needed was somebody to come along and walk beside her. The Honduran proverb is true. Grief shared is half grief. Joy shared is double joy. Almost 30 years ago, I took a group of teenagers to Six Flags. They were having a Church of Christ day. Trista was with us, and at the time, she was under this impression that if she was going to be a good girlfriend, then she needed to join me on all the rides and do the things I liked. What she didn't know was that I'll ride anything in the park. What I didn't know was that roller coasters terrified her. I still remember standing in line to get on the mind bender, and she was fidgeting. I didn't think much about it at the time, though. When we got on the ride, I thought everything was fine. The bars came down, and she grabbed a hold of my arm. When we started to go up that first hill, she gripped my forearm, and still today, if you look, you can see where the nails from her hand made a mark in my arm. Before we even got to the top of that first hill, she's in a full-out panic, and she starts to say through her tears, "Tell me it's going to be okay. Tell me it's going to be okay. Tell me this is all going to be okay," just over and over. I did the best that I could at that moment to reassure her. I tried to tell her that everything was going to be fine, but truthfully, I don't think she believed me. Here's the thing, though. What she was asking me to do is really what a lot of us need at different times in our lives. We need somebody to come along and say, "It's going to be okay. It's normal that you feel this way. I mean, I understand what you're going through. I've been through something like this before. It's going to be all right. Your story's not over. There's always a what comes next." I think that's one of the reasons that we're called to gather together, and Christianity is intended to be lived in community. God redeems the loss that's inevitable in our broken world by surrounding us with brothers and sisters that we can grab by the arm and say, "I just need somebody to tell me that it's going to be okay." So God redeems the loss through this unlikely relationship. Secondly, I think God redeems the loss through this undeserved kindness of Boaz. There's a lot in this story that seems normal to us because a lot of us grew up hearing the story in church, but really it's kind of weird. I mean, who buys property and expects to get a wife? That doesn't happen. But remember, the promised land was set up in such a way that each family has their designated section of land. And so if the heir to that land dies, it falls to the closest relative to redeem that loss. Oftentimes, they would redeem the loss by buying the property, marrying the widow, and then having a descendant with the widow who would in turn inherit the family's property. So when Boaz comes along and says, "I'll buy the property, I will take responsibility for Ruth," it's not just some small act of kindness. He's redeeming a Moabite woman, a woman that no other self-respecting Jew would have had anything to do with. And yet, here's Boaz who goes out of his way to redeem her. And I think there's a pretty good reason why. If you're paying attention, you might have noticed that the mother of Boaz was named Rahab. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because we talked about her a couple weeks ago. She was the prostitute from Jericho who helped the Israelites when they went in to take the promised land. It turns out that Rahab gets married. She has a son who she names Boaz. And that boy grew up to be a man who honored God and who provided for and protected those who were less fortunate. God uses Boaz to redeem the story. And yet God's still not done. You see, the story of redemption is not just Naomi and Ruth's redemption. The story ends with a genealogy where we learn that Ruth and Boaz get married, they have a son, and they name him Obed. Obed grows up, gets married, has a son named Jesse. Jesse grows up, gets married, and has a son named David, who would become king. And once again, God redeems all of these broken pieces and creates something beautiful out of them. The story of Ruth is this beautiful asterisk in the upper story of God. I mean, it's very different from anything else that we've noticed up to this point. There's not a great miracle, there's no act of God, no burning bush, no audible voice. As a matter of fact, there's no overt or obvious act on a single page of the story. But when you get to the end of the story, you know this for certain. God is at work. That's the message. That's the message of this story. that God is at work. That's the message of the upper story. God is at work. Right now, it may feel too late. Things may feel too broken for you, but God's at work. It doesn't seem obvious. His hand is not necessarily apparent in your life or in your situation, but God is at work. It may not be dramatic and it may not be immediate, but God is at work. You might think that your box, the box that you're living in right now, is labeled widowed or divorced or cancer or terminated or abused. That's not your story. Your story's not about your loss. Your story is about redemption. And if you'll just give God a chance to work, every box in your life will be marked loved by God, cared for by God, redeemed by God. We gather at the tables this morning because we need to. When it seems that life is falling apart or that nothing in our life is working out in our favor, we need to gather at the table to remember and to celebrate what God has already done for us. We need to be able to look across the table at one another and remind each other it's going to be okay. It might not be fun, it might not be enjoyable, but our story's not over because God is still at work. And so that's why we go to the table. It's my hope and my prayer this morning that you have a good discussion today around the table, talking about what God has done in your life, how you have been able to witness and to see Him at work, so that you can remind those that you gather with today that it's going to be okay. Never forget how deeply that you're loved. I hope that you have a wonderful time around the table. Please go in peace, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.